Now, Ambassador Tai, in the last few days, we've seen China pave the way for Chinese companies listed in the U.S. to be fully audited. As a trade negotiator, do you see that as a signal, perhaps, that China is willing to budge on some sticking points?
Well, as a trade negotiator, I know that the devil's always in the details. So I have been following this particular issue quite closely, although it's officially outside of my particular purview. But we are watching very closely the decisions that China is making.
But are you encouraged by it? I mean, after China's decision, do you see perhaps, some room for progress in negotiations between the U.S. and China?
Well, I have a very nice relationship with the chair of our Securities and Exchange Commission, and I would love to have a follow-up conversation with him to gauge how he is feeling about the conversations. I know that he is very focused on this set of negotiations. So, again, as a trade negotiator, let me reserve my judgment until I have more facts.
Because all eyes on the war in Ukraine, any sign at all that China or any other country is violating the sanctions?
I think with respect to the war that Russia is engaged in with Ukraine, all eyes are on not just Russia and Ukraine, but all the rest of us in terms of how we're going to react. And there's a complex set of dynamics at play, certainly on the economic front. But again, I think for all of us, we are all watching the choices that each of us makes very, very closely.
But any sign at all that China is violating anything, the sanctions? And might that impact relations, trade negotiations?
Again, I would say that we are all watching each other very, very closely, and these decisions are going to be consequential, not just with respect to the conflict in Ukraine, but we are going to be impacting each other in terms of the values that we express through our actions.
I want to touch on the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. The Court of International Trade has said that it wants the USTR to review, perhaps even explain some of the tariffs imposed. Do you think those tariffs are justified?
Well, let me just say that any time the Court of International Trade speaks and indicates that we're in litigation mode, I'll have to take a pass on making public comment and defer to my lawyers.
Is there concern perhaps that at some point the USTR, the U.S., may be forced to remove the tariffs?
I wouldn't describe it as a concern. I think that there are certain matters that are under review in our courts, and we continue to proceed with making sound and strategic trade policy.
Have those tariffs been effective? Because you've said before that the tariffs have not incentivized China to change its behavior. If it has not changed China, why not just remove the tariffs?
Well, I think that the tariffs are in place for a number of reasons, and they are having an impact. I think the question
what
is, they've certainly been noticed in Beijing, certainly, but also they have shaped trade flows here in Southeast Asia, we have seen. And they also are affecting the incentives of producers and consumers. I think that the question before us is identifying what our goals are with respect to how we intend to realign our relationship with China on trade and economic matters, and whether or not the tariffs themselves are effective at getting us there. They are having an impact. I think that the real question before us is whether these tools are sufficient or whether there are other tools that we need to bring to bear on getting us to where we would like to have a more balanced trade relationship with China.
One, how has it shaped the trade relations here in Asia? And two, what tools may be implemented? What else is there for the U.S. to do to impose further pressure, strain on China?
I think that it's less about what more we can do to China. I think it is more about how we can shape the U.S.-China trade relationship and, again, to realign it, to create incentives for our economic actors to ensure that this relationship is one that feels balanced, that is fair, and also importantly, that is contributing to a sense of security and resilience for not just our economies, but for the global economy. Because I don't think we are there right now, and I think that there is work for us to do, both on our own and also with our partners and allies.
There are concerns among Asian countries that perhaps at some point, because of the strain in relations between the U.S. and China, they would have to choose between the two economic superpowers. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there are always, again, decisions that are before us. But we're very clear-eyed in knowing that the United States and China are the two largest economies in the world. And that what we do in this economy, global economy, impacts not just the two of us, but the entire world. So in terms of the anxieties around the need to choose, I think that it is less about the need for our trading partners to choose than between us than our trading partners to develop strategies and relationships that reinforce a sense of resilience and sustainability for the entire global economy.
Has such a concern been expressed by the leaders that you've met, including the Prime Minister of Singapore?
Well, what I would say is the Biden administration's economic policy with respect to the Indo-Pacific is embodied in this economic framework that we are bringing to our engagement here. And we've been very clear about the purpose of that economic framework, which is to allow for the United States and our most like-minded partners in this region to be able to collaborate on key economic issues and emerging global challenges. And those include working together to promote resilience and sustainability for our own economies and also through partnership with each other's economies.
That takes us nicely to the Indo-Pacific Economic Cooperation. And China says that that framework is an attempt to create an Indo-Pacific NATO. It is an attempt to stop the rise of China. Your response to that?
Well, those are interesting ideas, and those are certainly not talking points or statements that are coming from our administration. Again, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is for our partners in this region, and it is for us to enhance our engagement and build on the partnerships here to promote what is in our self-interest, which is resilience, sustainability, inclusiveness in our economic engagements.
Could it lead to a decoupling?
So between whom and whom?
Well, U.S. and China, and hence forcing countries, trade partners, to choose sides again. Because if you take a look at Singapore's stance, it would rather have the U.S. rejoin TPTPP rather than have an Indo-Pacific economic framework.
So I hear a lot of questions around this idea of decoupling. And again, it's not a term that I use except in response to questions around it. I think it is important to distinguish between the concept of decoupling, which is kind of like a divorce between economies, I think, and this concept of reforming or realigning our economies. I think that we are very much focused on realignment in the global economy. I think that with respect to the disruptions and pressures that we have found on global supply chains, the lack of visibility that we all have into those supply chains, lack of accountability, and also lack of diversity in those supply chains are all issues that we are trying to address through realignment. So I would focus really on the kinds of changes that we're trying to bring, which are really not about stopping trade or trade divorce. They're really about bringing reform and a more strategic approach to trade.
How important is India to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? Because your colleague, Gina Raimondo, has taken issue with India having talks with Russia over oil. Your views on how important India is as perhaps a member of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework?
Well, again, if we look at the global economy and we look at the size and the potential for the Indian economy, India is very important. India is very important to our global economy and where we are all going in terms of our vision for the future. But you know, I think that some of the issues that Secretary Raimondo has raised really reinforce the notion that global economic relations are complex. It's multi-dimensional chess, perhaps for all of us. I think that, you know, in order to be effective in today's world and today's world economy, we have to be able to see the complexity in the matrices of choices presented.
So is there a need to see India in the same light as China, given that relations with Russia and the talks with Russia and the possibility of cooperation between the two countries?
I think that India is quite different from China. Also very, very large population, a lot of talent, and a lot of potential. The U.S.-India trade relationship has had a very different history from the U.S.-China trade relationship, and I think that we really have to, in approaching our relationships with each of our partners, make sure that we are tailoring our approach to each partner to that partner.
Just one final question before you go, because we're running out of time. You've been criticized for your trade policy. Some say that it lacks ambition. Some say you've not done enough to bring costs down for American companies. What do you make of those criticisms, and what can you do to allay some of those concerns?
Well, I think that for the people who are criticizing our trade policy, it is either because they are not hearing us when we describe what our objectives are, which is to bring a new approach to trade that ensures that trade policy can be and is a force for good. And I think that some of the other critics are impatient. So what I would say is we are very much focused on a vision for trade and a vision for America's leadership in trade and global economics that is focused on ensuring that trade is a tool for moving us into a better world.
Ambassador Tai, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.